I found a dark social network in the back of a bodega, and I'm never going back. Those 8 words sound performative when I say them out loud, like something a person posts to get clicks. But the shop down on Lenox isn't a punchline. It's where people come with parts of themselves missing, or with debts that don't show on any bank statement. It's where favors are traded like currency, and where a shelf named Helen will, if you watch long enough, restock itself. It looked like a grocery store from the sidewalk, a neon open that hummed, a hand-lettered sign advertising 2-for-1 plantains, a display of bootleg t-shirts and cheap batteries. At noon, it smelled of fried dough and lemon-scented cleaners. At midnight, it smelled of basil and old prayers. I almost didn't go back. I had a diploma in my backpack and a folder full of rejection emails from temp agencies and nonprofits. I had dreamed in college of saving patches of forest and rewriting municipal plans, of being the sort of person who could change the world one policy at a time. I came back to Brooklyn with 3 long-sleeved shirts, a bike with a wobbly wheel, and a head full of earnest arguments that never quite caught. Grandma Hazel's invite, "Come help out for a week, Jason, we could use you," was the kind of thing you'd say yes to when you needed a roof that smelled like someone else had actually cooked dinner in it. The market had been hers long before I was born. By day, it sold the usual invisible lifelines: loose rice in bulk, cough syrup, prayer candles tucked behind chewing gum. By night, it was a server room for a community no one else paid attention to. You could stand behind the counter and watch it switch modes like a lighthouse flashing different codes. A tourist might think it was just a place where an elderly black woman sold canned yams to the neighborhood. A different kind of customer, the ones who came in when the city exhaled, knew every square inch of those aisles like an app they'd logged into 1,000 times. I like to tell people I grew up adjacent to it. As a kid, I was permitted as a kind of half-witness. I stacked cans, learned to fold cardboard boxes neatly, and sat on the stoop while Grandma Hazel swept after closing. I knew the sound of the bell over the door better than I knew the ringtone on my own phone, but I was never initiated. Hazel kept the actual work to herself and a sloppily folded ledger of names. She'd smile and hand me a paper bag of carrot bread when I got off the bus, and she'd say, in the way elders say, that some things you only learn by living them. I believed her. I also believed the world I thought I was supposed to live in, the one with grant proposals and community gardens and very earnest LinkedIn posts. And so for a long time, I kept my hands out of the back room, literally and figuratively. The night she asked me to stay, she didn't say much.
"You used to like the smell of lemon," she said, as if restarting an old cassette. She handed me a key that felt heavier than it looked. "Do your cousins still put up that mural?" she asked, scrolling through something on her phone with a thumb that knew how to hold a corner of a paper bag steady. That night, I learned the shop had more than one layer. Behind the paper bag horror novels, behind the old Farmer's Almanac, behind a Frankenstein collection you wouldn't have picked up unless you liked the idea of things that didn't die properly, there was a spine on the shelf that was just a seam. I was bored, folding a stack of paper bags when the seam caught on my knuckle. That was how it always starts, with a hand moving, not looking for anything in particular, and finding a door. There was no dramatic gear, no dragon's roar. The Frankenstein book swung inward like a secret cupboard, and a thin passage opened. The air that came out smelled simultaneously of time and rain. A bell I didn't know we had chimed somewhere. Salem, who'd been sprawled on the geranium by the register, rose up and waited as if on cue. He is a gray cat with a face that is mostly indifference. People in my family call him the shop's familiar, but I now think of him as a roommate who has opinions about my life. He blinked at me once, long and round, as if to say, finally. The back room, the night shop, was everything the day market was not. Fluorescent light gave way to the warm, uneven glow of amber lamps and rows of jars with handwritten labels. There were boxes of roots so old their names had fallen into slang, tins of teas that smelled like 3 funerals and a wedding, and a shelf marked Helen that from a distance looked less like an organized section than like a concept someone had folded into wood. The surface of the main table was lacquered in wax and had a ring of burn marks that told you how often it had been used without needing to explain why. Hanging on the far wall was a map pinned with tiny notes, names, dates, addresses, a network diagram of favors and fealty. Grandma sat behind that same table like she'd grown out of it. She had the posture of someone who had memorized the map of the city's grief and kept it in the crook of her elbow. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and when she looked at me, I could see a version of myself that had kept some other promise. "You're late," she said, like a person whose authority is affection wrapped in a reprimand, and hungry, wash up. It is a small thing, but the first carrot tea she gave me tasted like home in a way I didn't know I had missed. The tea was cool and strangely sweet, and it made my teeth feel like they had been pressed against a warm stone. I learned later that food in the back room is not about nourishment alone. It's punctuation. A bowl signals seriousness. A shared skillet buys you honesty. A cup calls you to sit. We sat.
Salem settled on my shoelaces, as if anchoring me to the physical world. The Helen shelf revealed itself slowly. At first, you think it's a human joke, someone with a sense of humor. Then you notice the little things. A jar with green beans appears on a Tuesday after someone mentions voting rights. A quart of cream shows up in the morning after a woman's son's funeral. I watched the shelf 3 times in a row, not blinking, and on the 4th time, it did something it hadn't done before. A woman came in, not the sort you'd expect, thin, wrapped in a coat too light for the season, with hands like old paper. She used to buy a particular kind of soap. She left, and the soap was gone from the shelf. When she came back the next night with a lunch she had meant to offer the shop as a bribe, the soap was there again, new-looking, and the woman wept in the doorway. Grandma only hummed and made tea. Helen keeps track, she said later, with a tone that implied that Helen didn't always keep what you wanted. You realize that the night shop runs like a network because everyone there is connected by things that don't show up on the internet. A werewolf, mid-30s, always with a bar-coded shampoo, comes in wanting something simple, a conditioner that won't chemically react badly when he turns. He'll stand in the aisle and talk about his collar like it's a mortgage. A woman who might be a witch trades a bouquet of black roses for a jar of pickled plums. She keeps to herself and reads the newspaper at the back table, paging like someone cataloging the city for future use. A gentleman whose veins catch the light in bad ways comes in at times with a small cooler and exchanges what looks like medical waste for a vial of something nondescript that will keep him walking until next week. They use the shop like an app, a place you check in when nothing else will do. The language they use is old and practical and full of bargains disguised as small talk. I learned the code quickly because Grandma would not let me be stupid about it. Nobody comes in asking for miracles, she told me the first week. They come because they need to get back to being enough to feed someone, to keep their lights on, to take care of somebody else. You help like you would pass a cup of water. You don't give them the ocean. Her voice was small but had the weight of a city ordinance. She taught with parables. Once, after a woman left with a sealed paper bundle that weighed more than either of us expected, Hazel said, "People don't come to the shop because they're paid up with the world. They come because something's been taken. We don't promise to bring what's gone back. We help figure out how to live with the missing pieces." She waited for me to understand. When I stared at her and said, "Isn't that just consolation?" she laughed without meaning it to hurt. Consolation keeps babies from crying in the night. The rest of it is work. You do what you can. There is a kind of language in root work that is mostly ethical rather than technical. Grandma taught me boundaries by telling stories where lines were crossed and people were hurt. One woman I knew wanted him gone from her life, she said, standing by the work table and stirring nothing at all. She asked for a hand that would push him away. The hand came. She had to move out of her house, change her phone number, sleep with the light on for 3 years. She'd gotten rid of him, and she had to trade a whole life for that. You want to help someone? Ask what they'll owe for what you give. She never explained the mechanics. She explained the consequences. There's a satisfaction, the small kind, not the cosmic one, in being entrusted with something that others treat as fragile. Grandma gave me a starter hand, not a recipe, not a manual, but a set of small tasks. Organize the jars, learn to wrap a package so the edges won't cut a hand, memorize 3 names and the scents they prefer. Nothing fancy, she said. You are not ready for fancy. It was both literal and a test. I liked tests. They meant there was a process to follow, and I was something of a person who likes processes. My nights at the market were a skiff between 2 different cities. Daylight, I would sort oranges and answer the phone when people called asking for their aunt's number. Night, I would print labels by hand and hand over things that were more like promises than merchandise. People confided in me by the sensible light of the register, not because I earned it, but because I was the one who listened and did not moralize. Listening is an underrated trade skill in these parts. I had brought an activist's patience to it, the capacity to hear someone's story and not try to fix it on the spot. That seemed to be useful. Salem got in the habit of following me home in the late hours, and sometimes he'd sit on the windowsill like a gray gatekeeper. He had a way of appearing at the precise corner of the counter where mischief could be undone, and then looking at me with the heavy, disappointed eyes of someone who'd expected better. Once he stole a packet of gum and dropped it in the sink. He watched me dry my hands and didn't blink. "That cat judges me," I told Grandma, who only smiled. "He remembers your tantrums," she said. "Old cats know where the cracks are." The shop taught me about scale and discrete doses. A repair for one person might mean an exposure for another.
A favor in one block could ripple sideways into retaliation in another. The patron who used the shop is not merely seeking an object, but a recalibration of a life so that the bill doesn't land on the table with a hollow thunk. Rootwork and Conjure in Hazel's world were less about spectacle and more about triage, the kind of triage that keeps a grandmother from being evicted or a kid from being taken off the roster at school because of a rumor. I began to catalog the patrons the way you learn to map transit lines.
There was the man who came on Wednesdays and smelled of wet earth, who told me once that his mother taught him to make sure the dogs were fed when he was a boy. He called himself Luther, and he worked construction, and he had hands like someone who could lift a rebar and not look at the sky. He came in once with a stamp of dried mud on his shirt and asked for something that made the cash register vegetable silent. He didn't look like someone who had been to a back room before. His eyes had that particular rawness people get when they've been close to something they can't name. When the bell rings and it's Luther, he needs a favor, Grandma would note. She did not explain why with more than a nod. That nod seemed to carry a whole dossier of neighborhood history. Luther began to come more often. He started to tell stories at the counter in the way men tell stories when they are trying to find a version of themselves that isn't exhausted. About a crawl space that smelled like iron, about neighbors who didn't talk, about dreams that turned into the sound of a shovel hitting something that wasn't quite dirt. People brought stories into the shop like tools. You learned to listen for the ones that mattered and the ones that were diversions. You learned to suss out what was grief and what had an edge. Grief is a blunt instrument. Malice, on the other hand, has a neatness to it. The shop knows both. Grandma had rules, most of them unspoken. She believed in keeping records in the way an old librarian believes in index cards. Names mattered, dates mattered, slight details, the way a person folded their hands, the time they came in, the weather, were all potential threads. You didn't speak a name in passing unless you needed to. You didn't offer services to strangers who stumbled in drunk off the night. You didn't mix their offerings with someone else's. Consent, in that narrow circuit of favors, looked like an oath. She also believed in stories. She told me one about a man who had once come in asking for a thing that would fetch a debt from someone who'd wronged him. He paid a price for it that left his daughter with a cough she would carry for a year. "We are not a revenge shop," Hazel said, as if the sentence carried in it the sound of a judge closing a book. "We are a repair shop. Fix bad wiring, not people." At the time, I thought I understood what she meant. Fixing wiring is literal, repairing people is not. But there are times when the wiring is the people, and then the distinction gets messy. The patrons who came in at night were a cross-section of quiet desperation and odd needs. A young woman with ink-stained fingers traded a paperback for a small bottle of something we labeled for focus and left humming. A man in a transit worker jacket bought an amulet for his brother who'd been missing for months.
A woman who worked at the laundromat sat at the back table and told me about a river that kept stepping across people's thresholds. She asked for nothing and then went back to folding towels. We accepted offerings in the form of food, information, and sometimes nothing at all. The network's currency was not coins, it was favors, loyalty, and the preservation of an agreed silence. And yet, it was a social network, in the most literal sense. Names bounced between people. If one person had a need, another person was introduced. Someone who owed a favor could pay back with a job or with a cup of tea on a cold night. The map pinned on the wall had string between names, like the city had arteries. You could trace connections from a request for safe passage across a bridge to a name that meant a place where things were buried. The back room ran on reciprocity and discretion. It taught me that privacy can be a way of protecting people, but also a way to hide things. On an ordinary Tuesday, Grandma left for what she said would be a few days. She kissed my forehead like she always did when she left and told me, "Don't be tempted." I assumed she meant, "Don't use anything you don't understand. Don't pocket the money." Nothing more cinematic than that. She locked the door and went somewhere and left a note that read, "Keep Helen fed. Salem likes the back sun. Be nice." The shop seemed smaller without her. The map on the wall suddenly felt less like a map and more like a book with some pages missing. People came in and left notes folded into the cashier's drawer. They asked questions with their eyes. They tested me in small human ways. A price haggled so low you suspected someone else's hand might pick up the tab later. A request phrased in a kind of desperation that made me feel my voice like a tool too large for the job. And then Luther came in a way that made my stomach drop, as if someone had turned a key in a lock I hadn't realized I'd been watching. He was covered in dust, but not the kind that comes from construction. This dust had a bronze tint, like old bones given too much sun. His hands trembled in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor he did. When he spoke, his voice scraped along corners where I sensed he had been sleeping badly, which in the city often means the thing you're running from has found somewhere to sit in your skull. "I think somebody's been digging," he said without preface, placing his palm flat on the counter as if to steady himself. "Neighbors think I'm crazy. Blown out lights, like bulbs, keep shattering. Smell of soil in the vents. My dog won't eat. I hear scratching sometimes, Jason. I hear like scraping. He was looking at me, not Grandma, which made my throat tighten. He had graduated from telling stories into telling a complaint. That is the point where people's legs start to give way. I told him to sit. I didn't know any better options.
The backroom hum seemed to pick up, like the building itself leaned in to listen. Salem jumped onto Luther's boot and regarded him with the concentrated suspicion I get when I owe someone money. The man blinked and patted Salem, and Salem flicked an ear at the gesture as if to accept the bribe and move on. He handed me a photograph that folded along a crease like it had been carried in a wallet for a long time. In the picture, he, younger and square-shouldered, stood next to a child with a face like a question. On the back of the photograph were scribbled 2 words, "for keeping." He folded the photograph back and slid it toward me, as if that might buy me a better listening. "I don't want nobody to think I did something. I just want—" He couldn't finish. People like Luther rarely need the dramatic details. The pauses tell the story. A pause is the place where a curse or bad thing or a neighbor's contempt grows roots. My training at the university taught me to be methodical. My training on the stoop of a bodega taught me to trust patterns. Neither prepared me for the first time I realized the network could be used like a weapon. Grandma had told me stories about the cost of asking for something too sharp. Those stories had been warnings and also threats. Either way, their point was that the back room was a place where consequences carried a wayward weight. When Luther left, the movement in the shop felt like a physical thing. Grandma had not been gone long, yet there was an edge I could feel, like the night had learned to be more acute in her absence. I closed the register and watched the street through the glass for a while, because the city at midnight reads differently when a part of it has seen something that doesn't have a name yet. The lamplight made the open sign look like a promise I had no right to keep. That night, I made a decision that would fray other decisions in me later. I packed a bag, a flashlight, some gloves, a thick sweater, Salem, who objected but ultimately came, and a pocket of Grandma's carrot bread, because there is an economy of comfort that doesn't ask permission. I told myself I was going to look, to observe, to be a decent witness. I meant to be careful. I meant to be prudent. I also had the private thrill of doing something that felt important, rather than just telling people how to change a zoning board. At the door, leaning on the frame, I paused. The map on the wall, the pins and threads, looked suddenly like a web. The city outside smelled of diesel and rain-slicked asphalt. Cars kept going by, their headlights like eyelids. Inside the shop, the jars reflected the streetlights and made a field of tiny moons. Salem half turned his head and watched me with the same expression he had when he knew I was about to make a choice that involved risk or cheese. "I'll be back before light," I said. It felt like a promise, and like a lie.
I walked out into the night with the bag over my shoulder and the market's neon humming behind me like a memorial. The building where Luther lived was 3 blocks away, a place with stairwells that held the ghost of 100 quiet arguments, and a landlord who had the soft cruelty of someone whose rent checks came like clockwork. I walked and tried to name the feeling in my chest. Was it fear? Was it a strange sort of duty? Was it the old activist in me craving a problem to solve? The city answered in odors and murmurs. A stray dog ran across the street and disappeared. A couple argued inside a yellow-lit window and then reconciled with a clumsy kiss. The pulse of neighborhood life went by in vignettes, unbothered by the fact I was about to walk into a crawlspace that smelled oddly of iron. I didn't know then what the thing in Luther's crawlspace would turn out to be. I didn't know that the object we would find would rearrange my understanding of what our shop protected and what it could be used to do. I didn't know that the network stitched people together in ways that made walking away not just a personal choice, but an ethical one. I did know this was the place where favors could be used as weapons, and that the ledger Grandma kept in her head had more zeros than a bank account ever would. When I reached Luther's building, he was on the stoop, cigarette in hand, though the light made him look guilty. His dog sat alert, as if listening for instructions. It kept staring at the basement door like it knew a sound I couldn't hear. When he saw me, he fumbled with the words like a man who is given a key to a city he doesn't recognize. "I didn't want to bring you into it," he said, "but Grandma left. You were here. You know how to listen." I did know how to listen, and at that moment, stepping up into a hallway that smelled of old plaster and a sorrow someone hadn't paid a bill for, I made a series of small, irreversible choices,
that I would later frame as brave and foolish in equal measure. I went down into the crawlspace because a man asked me to. I took Salem because cats are less liable to panic than humans, and also because, in the night shop, familiars matter. I took the carrot bread because some things are rites of passage, and some things are hospitality. The stairs creaked in a way that made a map of tension in the bones. The basement door resisted at first, and then gave. The smell hit me, damp, mineral, like earth that had been turned with a motive. Luther's lantern threw a thin cone of light. On the concrete floor of his crawlspace, things looked ordinary, until they didn't. A circle, a bundle, the residual sheen of something buried, then unearthed. I moved in and felt the air thin in the way a story does when it prepares to become the thing you're not yet allowed to name. I wrapped my hand around the bundle because that's what you do when the world gives you an object that looks like a problem. I was careful not to do anything definitive.
I opened it as you open any strange packet, slow, as if doing otherwise might snap the world. Inside were remnants of stuff that belonged to someone else. A scrap of fabric, a token, a quiet brown thing tied with twine that had a smell like dust and old promises. It was not what I expected. It was instead a thing that smelled like consequences. At that moment, Luther's dog whimpered, and something on the other side of the room skittered. I raised my head, and in the pause my hands were aware of the bundle, and my chest was aware of a surge of something like heat in the bones. I had never been in a place that had asked me to be responsible in this particular way. Responsibility has the strange effect of revealing what you actually are, and in my gut the answer was a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a long, stupid hope that this would fit the arc I had imagined for myself when I was 20 and idealistic. The bundle fit less like a plot point and more like a warning in someone's handwriting. I could see the edges of what had been wrapped, and they looked older than the building. The air tasted metallic. Luther stood at the doorway as if the act of watching would keep something from happening. I felt suddenly very small, funny given my muscles, and the bag bulging with the things Grandma said not to bring. This is where I stop for now, standing in a crawlspace with something in my hands that smelled like another person's sorrow, with a dog at my feet and the city watching over. I had crossed a threshold I hadn't known was waiting for me. I had slipped from observer to participant in a network that had roots deeper than the mortar in the buildings. I was about to make a choice that would come to define the rest of what happened, and the rest of what I would choose about the shop and about myself. If you want more strange urban stories like this, hit like and subscribe, because if I tell this whole thing, you might want to know what comes next. I eased the bundle out of my hands the way someone sets a sleeping animal down, gentle, as if roughness might wake whatever had been tucked inside. Luther's dog sniffed at it once, all nose and sorrow, then backed away as if it had smelled something cruelly old. The concrete smelled of damp and machine oil. The crawlspace felt like the part of a book that hadn't been read in years but kept insisting it had something urgent to tell. The thing in the twine was not a scene from a horror movie. It wasn't theatrically grotesque. It was intimate and therefore worse. A collection of objects that had been pressed together to mean something terrible to someone, like a sentence folded until the edges hurt. There were scraps, fabric that had once been someone's shirt, maybe. Tiny hard fragments that glittered like old teeth in the flashlight, and a scent that made my eyes water without being anything I could name. It carried an intent in the way a clenched fist does, purposeful, directed, and private.
I lifted it because I felt, then and there, two things at the same time. One was the old, stupid thrill of taking action when you used to study policy papers to change cities. The other was the dawning realization that my action might matter in ways I had not consented to. I moved slow. Luther watched me, as if he were watching someone trying to perform CPR on a myth. His jaw worked. The dog whined like a small clock winding down. We took the thing back to the shop. The neighborhood had its late-night soundtrack, a siren far off, an argument in a doorway, someone slamming a car trunk. Under the neon, the market's glass reflected a city that had not yet forgiven exhaustion. When I pushed the back room door open, the smell of tea and wax washed over me, and for a second I forgot to be afraid, because the shop felt like a place where things were supposed to be mended. It was not Grandma who met me in the doorway. She arrived like a weather system, quiet, inevitable. She'd been gone just long enough for me to start doing the wrong things. She stepped in, took one look at the bundle in my hands, and folded her face into a shape I'd seen when someone reads a bill they knew was coming. She didn't shout. She didn't faint. She just said, "Show me." If you're picturing some ornate lecture where an elder explains the universe, that's not how Hazel managed it. She sat at the table and set the bundle down like you would set a stubborn child on a chair. Salem wound around her ankles and hopped onto the table where he could monitor the artifact with the combination of boredom and focus only cats manage. Hazel lit a small lamp,
The light thinned the shadows, not to banish them, but to let them breathe. She did not ask where Luther had gotten it. She knew. She had the air of someone who kept a ledger in her head and recognized entries by the way names sat against each other. That night she spoke slowly, as if choosing the shape of words mattered. "This is a boneyard bind," she said, "a thing that wants the living to be tied to what is under the earth. Not a spell for riches or love, less flashy, meaner. It wants you to stop, to sink. It's made to be small and patient." She didn't give me a recipe. She didn't say a single step. She said instead what it felt like. "It takes from you a part that is not yet ready to be buried." That phrasing was small, but enough to make my teeth ache. Hazel spoke as if she had seen it before, and as if seeing it had taught her a ledger of what that sight cost people. "Who would make something like this?" I asked, because asking is the thing you do when you want a plotline that ends in justice. I wanted to be detective and lawyer and activist all at once. Hazel's eyes were tired and old in a way that made you count your own years. "Someone with an old grudge," she said. "Someone who knows how to be unseen. Someone who wants another body carried down by their own town. These things are not random. They are paid for." Paid for.
The word landed like a dollar bill, crisp and small. Payment here wasn't always cash. It took favors, loyalties, secrets. It made the network sound less like a community center and more like a ledger, where your entries could be turned against you. She told Luther to sit. Her hands were quick, but not hurried, as if the motion itself was more important than hurrah. She put a cup of something warm in front of him, which he drank like water. He pressed his palms together like someone who was trying to hold himself in a hand-shaped space. The dog curled against his boots like a stiff prayer. Hazel considered the bundle in silence, then rubbed the lamp's rim with a thumb that had never been varnished smooth by anything but use. "I can make it loosen," she said. "I can shift the pressure so it breathes. I can't promise you sunflowers. I can promise you a place to stand." Her language was calibrated to modesty. She didn't sell salvation, she sold an alleviation. She asked Luther a handful of plain questions, not the type to elicit confessions, but the kind that let her map consequences. Amounts of sleep, recent arguments, someone new in his building, whether he'd kept any promises he wasn't proud of. Luther answered in fragments. He'd been angry. He'd admitted to slamming a door on a neighbor who'd been after him for weeks. He'd thought about moving, but didn't because the rent was cheaper where he was. He admitted to thinking something petty, something he'd never said aloud, and the way the room tightened at that tiny statement told me more than any detail. Hazel did not require a payment she'd asked me to carry in my backpack on some kitschy spiritual economy. She asked instead for a memory to be named, and for Luther to keep his dog fed and warm. "We keep the moral ledger by doing small, honest things," she said. "It is how we repay what we take back." That language, practical, non-theatrical, was part of the network's ethic. It wasn't about bargains with demons. It was about a system of informal care that sometimes got twisted. Some people used it to shore up a life. Others used it to push people under. That was the danger. The network could be a scarf that warmed you, or it could be a noose handed like a favor. What we did to the bundle, what Hazel did in that small, blinking sanctum with the jars and the map, is not something I can tell you step by step. There are rules for why I won't explain. But you can imagine a room smelling of lemon rind, smoke, and metal. You can imagine Hazel leaning over an object with the patience of someone threading a needle, and a voice that half sang things that sounded like old songs, but were not the words. You can picture Salem weaving between her knees as if you were part of the procedure, the cat's tail marking the rhythm like a metronome. I can tell you what it did to Luther. It uncoiled something in him. After Hazel's hands had done what they had to do, not miracle, not redemption, but something practical, his shoulders lost an inch of weight. He blinked like a man who'd been asleep standing up and then remembered how to walk. The dog's tail, which had been held like a caution flag, slipped into something like ease and nosed the bundle until Hazel waved it away. Luther laughed then, a small sound that didn't try to convince anyone. He wept a little, not theatrically, but honestly, the sort of crying that reseats you in your body. We didn't exchange receipts. He left with his dog, the photograph slid back in his pocket, folded the same way as before. He hugged Hazel the way you hug someone whose hands have returned a lost thing, awkward, full of gratitude. He left some bread in the store's counter with a slip of paper that said, "Thanks."
It felt honest and small, which in that room is sometimes the only currency that matters. After he left, Hazel did something I had seen her do before and always wanted, in my college righteous way, to do differently. She closed the ledger in her head a little less neatly than before. She sat back and smiled only so far as someone who was rechecking an old wound before it scabbed over. This was made by someone with access, she said. Probably local, someone who knows which graves are unmarked. That suggests a person with certain habits, certain permissions. Permissions? I asked. People who go where they shouldn't naturally go, she answered. A groundskeeper, a grave robber, someone paid to move things. Someone who thinks a life is a commodity and that the city's dead are just free storage. It was the word that did something to me. Paid, permission, ledger. It all rolled together into a picture I hadn't wanted to see. That the same network that fixed neighbors' lights could also be rent for cruelty. The stitches that held a community together could be rethreaded into traps. Do we know who? I pressed, because it is easier to be brave when you can name a villain. Hazel pinched the bridge of her nose. Not yet. But someone had to make that if they wanted it done right. Not an amateur. We need to pay attention to who asked for favors this month. You remember every face who comes in here, Jason. Start by writing them down. I should have felt flattered. Instead, I felt like I'd been deputized into a bureaucracy I didn't want. My head filled with image after image of faces in my ledger. Names on cards, favors owed, small acts of kindness transmuted into a marketplace of resentment. It was exactly the sort of system my city activist brain would have wanted to make transparent, accountable. It was also the exact sort of thing that couldn't be made transparent without destroying people who used it to survive. That night, I lay awake and thought about the woman Hazel had told me about, the one who'd asked for a hand and paid for it with a life rearranged.
I thought about law and policy versus the world's small, improvised systems. On paper, I liked the systems you could audit. In practice, the ledger in Hazel's head, the Helen shelf, the way favors were paid with food or babysitting or a late-night couch, they all made sense in a way budgets never could. But they also enabled harm in ways that weren't obvious until the harm had been done. Over the next days, I tried to make myself useful without overstepping, to be present but not greedy for power. I restocked jars, learned the names of new faces, and listened. People told me things in the day shop too, about jobs lost, about pregnancies, about cops who asked too many questions. At night, the eclectic cast continued to rotate through. A woman with a lopsided smile who traded information for a jar of pickled plums. 2 teenagers who came in to ask about a charm that would help a club promoter not get his schedule cut. A man who moved like he'd been stitched together and asked for nothing, but sat in the corner with a thermos of tea. The more I saw, the more I understood how the network functioned like any social platform. Reputation mattered, only privately. You were known for being fair or for slipping debts sideways. Connections meant resources. If someone powerful in one part of town owed a favor to someone in another, the benefit could flow. That fluidity made the shop both a safety valve and a pressure cooker. It could get you out of trouble, but it could also get trouble in. A week later, something happened that made the ledger's shadows feel personal. 2 men came in together, one wearing a uniform like he'd just finished a municipal job, the other with a face that could have been soft until you looked at the eyes. They asked for a thing in a way that suggested they'd bartered in fear. The man in the uniform, call him Rico, slid a photo across the counter and did something people do when they want a private audience. He leaned forward so the light caught his knuckles. "There's a woman who's been talking at the precinct," Rico said. He watched Hazel's expression with the nervousness of a man who knows a favor is currency. "She's got a tongue. I need it quieted. Not hurt, just make her leave town, memory shy maybe. She got into the wrong file, Jason. She found a name." Hazel's face was flat as a closed book. I felt for a second the old activist in me wanting to stand up and shout about due process and police accountability. Instead, Hazel reached for a mug and turned it between her palms like she was deciding whether to throw it. "We don't do that," she said quietly. "Not for lawmen, not for anybody who wants to use this place as a way to make another's life small. We help people carry what they're given. We don't teach them how to throw rocks through windows." Rico bristled. "You don't understand. This is for safety, for us." "Safety for whom?" Hazel replied. She wasn't shouting. Her voice was the iron edge of a blade in a drawer.
For you or for your record? You come in here and ask for a silence. We give you a choice. You can go by the book or you can go by the street. We don't traffic in silences that aren't earned. Pay us with proof you tried the other way. The man in the uniform smiled in that sharp, official way, and I could see the years of a system giving him entitlement. He left without blowing up the shop. He didn't like being refused. He strode out, and the bell above the door clanged like an accusation. Later, he stood across the street watching the window as if he might find a crack to wedge into. That moment shifted something else in me. It was not just the knowledge that some people wanted to weaponize the network. It was seeing how close the shop's refusal of that offer placed it in the crosshairs of systems that believed they could buy discretion. I thought of Luther's bundle and the way some grudge had been monetized into a device that would suck a man down, and then I thought of the man in the uniform and how many options he had that Luther did not. The choices in the back room were grimly pragmatic. Hazel kept a list of things she would not do, and the list was as important as the ledger of favors. She acted like an ethic committee that refused to file itself with public records. It was noble and narrow, and sometimes made enemies. A month into helping out in earnest, I made a mistake that pushed me toward the decision I would make later. There was a woman, young, fierce, and always with paint under her nails, who came in one night and wanted something to make someone forget her name. She had been harassed for months by an ex who kept leaving her belongings in the hallway and calling to threaten her work. She was exhausted and terrified, and asked in a voice that was almost a sob for a way to be invisible to him. Hazel sat with her and took in the story. She listened to the girl's details like a judge weighing intentions. In the end, Hazel refused to facilitate an erasure that would cut someone out of the social document without a chance to make amends. Instead, she offered practical supports, a temporary place to stay, introductions to people who could help with restraining orders, cash for a train ticket if she wanted to leave town for the weekend. The girl left angry. She told me later that Hazel's refusal felt like an old woman's moralizing when what she wanted was a clean slate. She left in tears and a fury that made her appear both righteous and small. I agreed with Hazel and also felt a prickly anger at the limitations of what Hazel could offer. This contradiction burrowed into me like splinter. It was the precise sort of moral knot that made the shop what it was, a humane, reluctant triage that couldn't always match the magnitude of modern violences. There were nights when I resented Hazel's boundaries. They felt like wasted chances to fix everything.
There were other nights when I was grateful she refused, because I saw what happened when people made hurt a currency. It complicated the map I kept in my head. It made my commitment to stay feel less like joining and more like making a contract with a body that would always ask questions I couldn't answer. The final push toward my decision wasn't a single event, so much as a slow collapsing of clarities into one impossible object. It happened after the man in the uniform started showing up more often in the market, watching from a distance as though counting the minutes until he could force the shop into a corner. It happened when I found, tucked in the ledger Hazel kept, a name I'd seen on a job roster from City Hall, someone who'd had access to burial ground maps and who suddenly now owed an unaccounted favor. It happened when a neighbor who'd come into the shop asking for help with her son's ballgame costs was accused by a court of something based on rumors swirling from who owed what to whom. It happened when Hazel took a call and afterwards sat down at the table and said, "We have a problem." "What's the problem?" I asked, because I wanted to hear the diagnosis that would give me the tools to fix it. "We have people who are using the network to remove obstacles," she said, "not to help folks keep roofs over their heads, but to hide things, to move outcomes. They keep their hands clean because the shop is only a node. Someone asks something in a bar, and 3 favors later, a person gets displaced. We are a hub, and hubs can be used." Her eyes met mine then in a way that made me feel like I was a child again, being told I'd been chosen for something not all kids survived. "You can stay," she said slowly. "You can do the work, but you need to know. If you stay, you're going to see people choose wrong things. You're going to have to bear witness. You're going to have to sometimes refuse a neighbor's plea and risk their anger. And worst of all, you'll have to keep secrets that may be heavy." I thought of the ledger I'd seen. I thought of Luther and the bundle in his crawl space. I thought of the man in the uniform and his idea of justice. I thought of the woman who wanted to vanish. The part of me that loved paperwork and policy wanted to design transparency. The part of me that loved community wanted to patch wounds quietly. Neither option felt like a clean solution. I walked home that night through the city with my shoulders tight. The decision condensed into a single terrible clarity. Joining the shop as a permanent member of the backroom meant signing on to a life where I could be asked to enable harms I did not believe in. It meant keeping secrets maybe corrosive enough to rot a person from the inside. It meant my name being one more node in a network that could be used to shelter and to hurt. When I spoke to Hazel the next morning, I tried to be delicate. I told her that I needed to think. I didn't want to dishonor the work. I didn't want to abandon the people who needed the shop's quiet repairs. But I also could not imagine going to sleep knowing I'd been made complicit in a system that sometimes traded in wreckage. Hazel listened. She did not try to guilt me. She did not beg. She looked at me as if making the right thing obvious was part of being an elder. "You have a mind that wants to make rules," she said. "That is a good thing. This place needs people like that, but not everyone should be in the room when the decisions are made." I had imagined her telling me not to go, to stay. Instead, she told me, without drama, "If you leave, don't make a scene. The shop is still here, the ledger is still here. People will come, we will carry the work. If that's not your path, it's not your path." "I don't think I'm cut out for the ledger," I said, "or the part where someone asks me to hand them a silence." She smiled, the ghost of an old joke passing over her face. "Some people are made for the ledger, some for lending their backs. You are good at listening without trying to be a hero. Maybe go be a hero where the rules are clearer." I could have argued. I could have insisted I was brave enough, or that I'd learn. Instead, I felt the decisions subtle, like a coin in a pocket. It wasn't dramatic. It was a practical thing. I would leave. Not because I didn't love Hazel, not because I didn't respect the network that had helped people, but because some systems demand more moral elasticity than I could afford. They required you to hold moral contradictions in your hands and never let them slip. I realized I had limits that were as real as anyone's. On my last night working the back counter, the Helen shelf did what it does best. A jar of something innocuous appeared at dawn. A loaf was placed where someone had been hungry. The patrons came and left, some with the private relief the shop made room for, others with the sharpness of someone who'd been refused. Salem followed me into the small apartment I kept above a laundromat and curled on the windowsill like a small, judgmental god. I packed my bag with a slow tenderness. Hazel's carrot bread for the road, the same flashlight I'd used in Luther's crawlspace, a few shirts that smelled of store lemon. Grandma watched me with a face I couldn't quite read. There were no speeches. She wrapped a scarf around my neck that smelled of smoke and thyme. "You are welcome back," she told me, "but not everything is meant to be recounted. Keep some of what you saw to yourself. People will need to trust this place." "Will you be okay?" I asked. I suppose I expected a false bravado, a line about resilience. She folded her hands and considered me like petitioning a judge. "We will keep doing what we've always done," she said. "The shop has weathered worse. The ledger shifts. People come, people leave. We mend in ways that don't always look clean. You don't belong here in the way you belong to other things. That's all right."
Salem hopped off the sill and walked in front of me, tail high, as if inspecting my boots. He rubbed against my calf in a way that made me feel both forgiven and warned. I put my bag over my shoulder. I thought of Luther's laugh as he walked away, of the photographed child with a face like a question, of the woman whose paint-stained fingers had hummed as she left. The network would go on, humming like a server room under a grocery store's blinking neon. As I stepped out into the street, the neon open sign blinked and hummed like a pulse. The market was exactly where it had always been, both ordinary and clandestine at once. I took a breath of cold air that tasted of pavement and the residue of other people's nights. I walked away. I can pretend my leaving was a grand moral exit. It wasn't. It was a set of small, ordinary choices stitched together until they made a seam. I left because some pieces of the world I loved required me to choose a kind of refusal. I left because I didn't want to be the kind of person who, in a decade, could claim ignorance when asked how someone had been made small. I left because I had a limit for what I could carry without breaking. That decision did not feel like a victory lap. It felt like a realignment. Walking away was also a kind of survival. The shop is heavy with secrets I didn't earn. It asks of you a kind of moral elasticity that can stretch into callousness if you're not careful. I am not saying Hazel and the people who work there are wrong. They save people in ways the city sometimes cannot. But I am saying that the cost of that service is not mine to pay forever. Sometime since then, I've caught glimpses of the network's edges in the ordinary city. A woman I knew from community meetings came into my life again, less frantic because a favor in the right place had smoothed the way for her housing. A man I knew from a protest collected his son from a school that had seemed poised to cut him out after a rumor. These were small miracles, public in their kindness. But there were other nights when a neighbor would cross the street to avoid my eyes because they thought I might be part of a shop that could hurt them. The network doesn't live on my conscience anymore, but it lives on, and that means it will do both good and harm in quiet ways. People ask me sometimes, friends, strangers, commenters looking for a crisp lesson, if I regret helping that night with Luther. I don't regret it. He needed a thing that was not obvious and someone who could show up without judgment. I don't regret being part of that rescue.
I regret, though, the moment I imagined staying as a solution to every complex problem I saw. I regret thinking I could fix systemic rot by being an excellent node in a shadowed network. There are limits to patchwork. There are times when policy matters because it changes systems at scale.
There are other times when a neighbor needs a casserole and a person to sit with them while the world spins a little less hot. I am not immune to the first-hand kind of compassion the shop showed. I am only wary of the price. On the day I left for good, Grandma stood at the doorway and held the bell until it stopped chiming. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't tell me to go. She handed me a small envelope with a scrap of paper inside that said in her handwriting, "If you ever miss this, come sit. We will not pressure you. The door is not a trap." "I won't come back," I told her, and the words surprised me with their bluntness. They were not a taunt or a defiance, just a clear boundary. I need to draw a line. For me. She looked at me as if folding a letter. "Then keep that line. Your life is yours. Some roads we walk to learn what not to do." I hugged her, which in Hazel's house is a complicated thing, because she hugs like a person who fears clogging up the world with more of themselves. When I stepped down off the stoop for the last time, Salem perched in the window and watched me with the same half-blink he'd given me when I'd first opened the Frankenstein book. He sat almost like a sentinel, neither forbidding nor inviting. I walked away from the neon and the jars and the map and the ledger. The city had not changed. The market's bell clanged behind me. Someone laughed in the alley. I let myself be just another person moving through the city, carrying the small knowledge that the world is stitched together in more ways than code and law. I did not feel triumphant. I felt sober and tired and lighter in a way that surprised me. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the shop turning its private gears. I imagine Helen restocking in the hush between trains, a jar appearing on a shelf to become someone's salvation. I imagine Hazel, stooped and steady, keeping records in a head that resists being digitized. I imagine people who need help finding it and trusting it. The network is still there. People will keep showing up. Those who stay will keep carrying a ledger of things that the rest of the city cannot see. But for me, the choice was clear. I found a dark social network in the back of a bodega, and I'm never going back there again. Not because it is all wrong, not because it doesn't help, but because belonging to that ledger would ask me to be complicit in things I refuse to be. I can be a friend to people who deserve care. I can work for policies that reduce the need for secret favors. I can learn other ways to be useful. That, for now, is enough. If you liked this kind of story, tell me which part you'd never come back from in the comments. Then subscribe if you want more strange urban nights.